There is a document sitting inside a glass case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. You could walk in and look at it yourself this week if you wanted to. That document states that a king named Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. The next king, Alangar, ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings total, 241,200 years combined. Then a flood came, and every number after that suddenly dropped back down to something human. For 100 years, mainstream scholarship called this mythology, invented narrative, ancient exaggeration. But a group of climate scientists asked a completely different question about these numbers, and what they found inside ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet is quietly forcing historians to rethink everything they assumed about this document. Before we go any further, I want to know what you think right now before you hear any of the evidence. Drop a comment below. Do you believe these numbers are pure mythology? Or do you think ancient people were trying to record something real in the only language they had? Type A for mythology. Type B for real memory. I am going to read every single response. This is not a fringe theory. This is not a conspiracy website. The Sumerian king list is one of the most studied documents in the history of archaeology. It was first excavated at Nippur in 1906 by archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht during an expedition funded by the University of Pennsylvania. Since then, researchers have recovered more than 18 separate copies of the list, written on clay tablets and prisms spread across different ancient cities in Mesopotamia. The most complete version we have today is the Weld-Blundell Prism, a 4-sided clay object inscribed on every face, currently housed and on public display at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. Every serious copy of this document agrees on the same core data. 8 kings ruled before the flood. Their combined reign totaled 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over the land, and after the flood, kingship descended again from the heavens, with rulers holding power for decades instead of millennia. This is the official archaeological record. It is sitting in one of the most respected museums in the world, and nobody has ever fully explained what those numbers actually mean. The obvious explanation most people reach for is simple. Ancient people invented large numbers to make their kings sound godlike. Case closed. Except that explanation falls apart the moment you look closely at the evidence. First, these are not vague poetic numbers. They are precise. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 72,000 years. Numbers that specific, recorded consistently across 18 independent copies of the same document, are not the product of casual storytelling. Scribes, who were also trained accountants, wrote these numbers down the same way they recorded grain shipments and tax records. Second, scholars who attempted to reinterpret the numbers using different counting systems, including the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system, still could not produce figures that match normal human lifespans. The numbers remain astronomical regardless of how you convert them. Third, and this is the part that stopped me cold, the document itself draws a hard line. Before the flood, those numbers. After the flood, completely different numbers. The scribe who wrote this was not confused about the difference between mythological time and historical time. He marked the boundary explicitly. Something happened at that dividing line that the scribe considered absolute and definitive. So, if the simple explanations do not hold up, what does? A group of researchers from an entirely different scientific field found a thread worth pulling. And they were not looking at clay tablets. They were looking at ice. In 1997, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pitman at Columbia University published research proposing that a catastrophic flood event reshaped the Black Sea region sometime around 7,500 years ago. Mediterranean saltwater, they argued, broke through the narrow land bridge at what is now the Bosphorus Strait and poured into what was then a freshwater lake surrounded by inhabited land. The water rose fast enough that communities along the shoreline had to abandon everything and flee. Survivors carried that memory with them across the ancient world. But the flood evidence that most directly connects to the Sumerian king list comes from a different event and a different dataset entirely. Scientists studying deep-sea sediment cores and Greenland ice cores have confirmed a climate event called Meltwater Pulse 1A. Approximately 14,600 years ago, global sea levels rose somewhere between 16 and 24 meters in a period of roughly 300 to 500 years. This is not a fringe estimate. It is documented in the scientific literature reviewed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The ocean rose by a height taller than a 6-story building within a time frame that, in geological terms, was nearly instantaneous. What existed before that rise? The Persian Gulf as we know it today was, for most of the last ice age, dry land. A fertile river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates extended far beyond their current mouths into what is now open water. Researchers, including Jeffrey Rose at the University of Birmingham, have published work suggesting this submerged landscape, sometimes called the Gulf Oasis, may have supported human populations for thousands of years before the waters rose and erased it entirely around 8,000 years ago. Think about what that means. An entire inhabited world, gone, beneath the water. And the people who survived it had to explain to every generation that came after them what had existed before the ocean swallowed it. Here is where the data gets genuinely difficult to dismiss. Climate scientists studying the late Pleistocene epoch, the period of Earth's history, ending roughly 11,700 years ago when the last ice age concluded, have identified 8 major climate phases in that final period before the Holocene began. The Holocene is the period of relative climate stability, during which all of recorded human civilization has existed. 8 major climate phases before the Great Transition. 8 kings in the Sumerian king list before the flood. That parallel does not prove anything on its own, but it raises a question that deserves to be asked out loud. What if the reigns in the king list are not recording the lifespans of individual rulers? What if each reign is recording the duration of a climate era? A period of relative stability, that ancient memory compressed into the figure of a single powerful king. This interpretation was proposed in serious academic literature. Scholar Thorkild, Jacobson at the University of Chicago, and later Stephanie Daly at Oxford, both engaged with the idea that the pre-flood section of the king list preserves memory of a world that existed before catastrophic environmental change, not as literal biography, but as encoded cultural memory. The Sumerian king list is not the only ancient record pointing toward a major climate disruption as the dividing line between 2 different worlds. The Ipuwer Papyrus from ancient Egypt describes years of darkness and agricultural collapse in language that matches the atmospheric effects of large volcanic eruptions and climate disruption events recorded in ice core data. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world, collapsed abruptly around 4,200 years ago, during a period now identified in global climate records as the Four-Point-Two Kiloyear event, a prolonged drought that struck across a wide band of the ancient world simultaneously. 3 separate civilizations, 3 separate written records describing catastrophic disruption, 3 separate datasets from ice cores, deep-sea sediment, and geological survey, all confirming the same underlying climate events. When independent sources converge on the same disruption from different directions, that is not mythology. That is signal. Here is the question I think scholars have been asking wrong for 100 years. The standard question has been, why did ancient Sumerians invent such absurd numbers? The better question is, if you survived a climate catastrophe that erased the world your grandparents described to you, how would you preserve the memory of time itself? When no calendar system from before the disaster had survived, you would attach each era to a figure, a king, a name people could remember, and you would assign to that figure the length of the era he represented, not the length of a human life. The Sumerian king list may be the oldest climate record in human history. Not written in the language of science because that language did not exist yet. Written in the only language available to a survivor civilization, the language of kings, gods, and floods. What the ancient scribes were preserving was not a list of rulers. They were preserving the shape of time before everything changed. Each reign, a chapter. Each chapter, a climate era. The flood, not a mythological event, but the actual, physical, documented boundary between the Ice Age world and the world we live in now. The document is not wrong. We have been reading it wrong. Climate cycles do not stop. They do not conclude because a civilization decides to write them down. They continue. The Holocene that began after the last great disruption gave humanity roughly 11,700 years of relative stability, enough time to build cities, develop writing, and eventually send probes to the outer edges of the solar system. That stability is not permanent. Every climate record we have confirms that. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If the Sumerian king list is a memory of what the world looked like before the last great disruption, encoded by survivors who had no other way to preserve it, what are we encoding right now for whoever comes after us? The document is in Oxford. The ice core data is in Greenland. The climate record is being written in real time. The flood did not end the story. It started a new chapter, and we are somewhere inside that chapter right now, without knowing how close we are to the next dividing line.